A leper father. Tojo Kouichi. I was diagnosed with leprosy when I was 16 years old. However, 2 to 3 years before that, leprosy marks had appeared on my face, and I had blisters on my right leg from being heated by a kotatsu. My father was concerned about the marks on my face, and whenever he saw me, he would stare at me sullenly. When I returned from school, before I even put my bag down, he would take me out into the sun and try pressing or pinching the marks with his hand. Sometimes he would poke it with a needle and ask if it hurt. Whether we had guests over or we were eating, my father would casually and carefully stare at my face. Even after I went to bed, I would wake up and sometimes I would be shocked to see my father staring at me. My mother prayed to God that my marks would move to my back and buttocks, and encouraged me to develop faith. During this time, I tried using ointments and ginger soup, but it didn't work. I went to a shrine about 2 miles from my house, and for 21 days, before dawn, I began to travel 2 miles back and forth to the shrine, which was about 2 miles away. Even though it was a cold time of year, in front of the shrine, where the stars were shining, I held my hands on the frost-covered earth and cried and prayed for the marks to heal. When I graduated from high school, I was diagnosed with leprosy. At that time, my father was a craftsman in his 50s. It must have been no easy task for me to finish high school. When I returned home after being diagnosed at the prefectural hospital, my father was crying with a trembling voice. I cried, and so did my mother. My father insisted on cutting me down and then cutting his stomach open as well. If my mother and sister had not been there, what would have happened? The second leper, the one who had cried out loud when I knew him, was also on the dim tatami mat. The cold light of my father's discarded sword was shining brightly. It seems that my second brother was ill when I was still a child. By the time I was 7 or 8 years old, my brother's illness had progressed considerably, and most of his hair and eyebrows had fallen out. Moreover, his face, covered with ulcers, was shining black. His hands and feet were wrapped in bandages. He seemed to have lived in hiding all day. This was a tenement house with only 2 rooms. My brother always stayed in the 3 tatami room. It was a long, narrow room with a floor covering between the wooden boards, and there was a small hearth that my father had set up for him. There was a cupboard at the back, and when we had guests, even in the middle of summer, my brother would hide in this cupboard, carrying a sake bottle that served as a teapot. If guests stayed long or did not return by mealtime, my brother would often cough in the cupboard or kick the paneling vigorously with his feet. My mother would panic and deliberately cough a few times, signaling that he should be patient a little longer. Sometimes she would stand up and whisper to my brother in the cupboard that the mice were making a lot of noise and it was bothering him. My mother was most concerned about my brother's convenience. Since we shared the toilet with our neighbors, my mother would go there first, make sure no one was there, and then stand guard at the entrance to the toilet. Even so, there were times when I would go to the toilet while my mother was away and be accidentally seen by the neighbor's child. Because one time the child from the next door asked me, "There's a strange person in your house. Who is that?" I remember turning red and denying it. At the time, I didn't know why my brother was hiding. Of course, there was no way I could have known he had leprosy. My brother took a bath about once every 10 days. I would occasionally see my mother and sister putting him in a wash basin in a hut surrounded by boards and straw mats in the backyard, avoiding the public's eyes, and washing him. My brother had a strange smell, and he was always infested with lice. If my older sister or other brothers were to accidentally complain that the house stinks and they can't stand it, my brother would yell at them with a ferocious anger. At such times, my mother would cry and apologize to my brother. My brother would also ask me to do the shopping in secret. I felt sorry for my brother, so I listened to everything he had to say. When I bought some sweets, my brother would give me some of them with a grin on his face. I ate the sweets without any qualms and also played with my brother. At that time, my older sister and younger brothers would complain that it was like keeping a thief in the house, and that they couldn't just leave things there by mistake. I must have caught my brother's illness through these kinds of interactions with him. My father drank a lot at that time. I would come home from work and drink at a bar. Even after my older brothers and sisters had returned from work and everyone had finished dinner, my father's tray was always set by the hearth. When 7 or 8 o'clock rolled around and my father was still nowhere to be seen, my mother would go back and forth to the gate, grumbling to herself. My older brothers would quickly go out to play, and only my mother, my older sister, me, my little sister, and my brother who was hiding were left behind. On nights like this, when my mother and I went out to pick up my father, he would either be at the bar we frequented, or he would have collapsed by the roadside, drunk, or he would be on his way home with someone, and my mother and I would come home carrying my father, who had lost all movement in his limbs, on our backs. When my father got home, he immediately asked for more alcohol. And when my mother tried to scold him, my father would get angry and speak harshly. They ended up fighting, and my mother, who had always had a hard time since she was young, would quickly lose her temper and scream, while my sister and I, who were small, desperately tried to stop the fight by clinging to my father's legs and my mother's sleeves, being pushed from side to side. This continued almost every night. At first, the neighbors came running over to mediate. But, after such a commotion, my father would always go to the 3 tatami room and spit his words at my brother. "It's because of a fool like you that the whole family has to go through all this trouble. Why don't you just die already?" My brother just bowed his head in silence. It was one autumn, shortly after the cleanliness law had been put into effect. On the day of the general cleaning, my brother couldn't stay hidden in the house, so he would take some rice and hide in the mountains 4 or 5 miles away before dawn. After the cleaning was finished, he would return home after the sun had set. One day, when I came home from school, I found my father busily digging a hole in the small backyard. The hole was quite large and deep, and my father's head was just above the ground as he was using a scoop to push up the soil. I peeked over the edge of the hole and asked him what he was doing digging such a big hole. He looked up at me, and for a moment he glared at me with a frightening look in his eyes. "None of your business, you brat. Go away." I was shocked and sneaked away. The hole was left as it was for 4 or 5 days. One night, I was suddenly awakened by a noise. There was some kind of commotion all around. I sneaked a peek from inside the futon and, in the dim light of 10 candles, my father was sitting silently by the hearth with his fists clenched. My mother was beside him, hunched over, biting her sleeve and crying quietly. And in the 3 tatami room across from them, my younger brother and sister were wrapping bandages around my sick brother's dark upper arms. My spine shivered and I slipped quietly into the futon. When I came home from school the next day, the hole in the back had been neatly filled in and the air smelled of new earth. Later, from eavesdropping on what my parents were saying, I imagined that night, with my brother's consent, my father had killed him with a metal club and was planning to secretly bury the body in the hole in the back. However, when my father hit him, my brother suddenly screamed, and the neighbors came running. After this incident, my father spent more days in silence and drank more. This was not the only incident like this. One time, my father tied a stone around my brother's neck and tried to make him throw it into a swamp in the mountains. He jumped in but did not die. So the other brothers could not bear to see him and went into the swamp to rescue him from drowning. One time, he tried to hang himself. And another time he jumped under the railroad tracks, but was thrown off and did not achieve his goal. My father's frustration and anguish grew day by day. When I was about 10 years old, one day my brother suddenly disappeared. After that, I heard from him and found out that he was in a sanatorium on Mount Minobu. It must have been 4 or 5 years since then that a faint light shone on my house. But it became my disease. My father would often tell me when I was 16 years old, if you are born a human and don't have a normal body or can't live a normal life, it's pointless to live. You don't deserve to live. It's better to die quickly than to suffer long-term shame. It takes more than a minute to die. If you cut your throat with a razor, everything will be solved. If you don't have the courage to do it, I'll cut your throat and show you how. At times like that, my father would say this in a quiet tone, staring intently at me. I was so scared that my torso trembled. I couldn't sleep peacefully at night. I had no hope or motivation. But I didn't push it so hard that I would commit suicide. My only savior was my elder brother, who lived separately in town and worked as a music producer at a movie theater. He would sometimes take me to town, treat me to delicious food, and show me movies. Sometimes he would take me to the mountains or fields to comfort me. When we said goodbye, I would always cry and ask him to come home quickly. Days like this continued in March, and as the month went by, I received a message from my brother, who had moved from Minobu to Fukase Hospital in Kamiyama, telling me to come immediately if I was ill. In the fall of that year, my father took me to Fukase Hospital. During the journey, my father had decided to die, and tried to take me with him on the way. But later, after he was discharged from the hospital, my mother told me that he had given up, and I felt a chill down my spine. I wondered what would have happened if the journey between Gotemba and Fukase Hospital had been longer, or if we had gone to Kamiyama at night. Regarding my life at the Fukase Hospital, I will only record that I was baptized by Father Dorwell de Lacy and that the daily life there left an indelible impression on me. However, I had to leave the Fukase Hospital in less than a year, as my parents wanted to see me with all the marks gone. My parents were simple and happy, thinking that I would be cured of leprosy as soon as the marks on my face disappeared. I ended up doing ordinary labor work, feeling lonely inside. The most painful thing for me was having to inject maple oil into my body when I was completely exhausted after work. It took a lot of willpower to have to inject it regularly, unless it was on a Sunday or some other special occasion. Moreover, I had to avoid the eyes of others in our tiny tenement house. While I was dissolving maple oil in the bath, a customer would suddenly show up, or a neighbor would come in while I was giving an injection, and I would get quite flustered. Also, while I was working, the injection site would hurt and sometimes suppurate, and my coworkers would often think I was strange. I continued on for about 3 years, but there was no change in my illness, and I grew tired of being the only one to suffer pain and get injections. I also stopped going to church. This tired feeling made me give up, and I was made into a momentary hedonist. I remembered drinking and having fun with women. And so 2 or 3 years passed. Spots began to appear on my face again. The time I had been dreading had finally come. I had secretly resolved to die. The memories of the reconstruction hospital and the emotions of the day of my baptism had disappeared from me, and were replaced by a feeling of estrangement from the world and self-deprecation. Around that time, my sister had fallen ill. My father was once again in agony, and my mother was once again in grief. I wandered the streets in search of alcohol, and one spring, after the conscription examination, I committed suicide without telling anyone. It has been nearly 8 years since my sister and I settled in our current sanatorium. The Lord will never abandon even the most sinful person, no matter when or where. The Lord has nurtured within me a warm heart of filial piety like any other. I once encouraged my father to convert. When I returned from the reconstruction hospital, I would occasionally speak to him and explain to him in an easy-to-understand way about salvation, Christ, the church, etc. But he would just say, "Oh, you mean Jesus?" And my mother, seeing the cross and medals I had, would say, "But we have gods and Buddhas worshipped in our house, which have been passed down from our ancestors." After that, I myself left the church. When I came here and returned to Catholicism, I couldn't help but worry about my elderly parents. I thought that I had to do something to save their souls, since they had not had such a blessed life. I wrote my father another long letter. I received no reply from him. I wrote him another letter. My father also has stomach cancer and can't even drink thick soup now. The doctor has already declared that he does not have much time left. If God does not exist and eternal life is not promised to us, I would not be able to bear thinking of my father. I bow my head before the Lord and pray. That is the only path and filial piety that has been given to me. If God is true, He will not allow you to be tempted beyond your strength, but will give you the means to overcome the temptation so that you will be able to endure it. 1 Corinthians 10 verse 13. I was born the father of 3 lepers and suffered in vain. I will never be born again, and I will never serve the world again. Voice. January issue.